are confronted, those that experience the reality of suffering, are the same individuals that James says we as believers now esteem those people to be blessed people. You know, looking back at it and seeing someone like Enoch, and how he was blessed in his life to be translated that he should not see death. Looking back and seeing someone like Noah, I mean, the rigor that he had to go through in building the ark and all the affliction, all the name calling that would have taken place inside of his life, but see how he was blessed. And looking at men like Abraham who left Ur the Chaldees and everything that he knew and just entered into a very uncomfortable place of his life. And then later on in his life, called to offer up his only son upon a mountain that God was going to tell him. And just the immense anxiety that would have surrounded him inside of that immediate instance. And we could go on and on and on. But in hindsight, I think is a driving force for verse 10 and verse number 11. In hindsight, us being able to look back at their examples, we saw how God was really formulating their life and bringing them into a better place, a better season, a better circumstance where they could be more of a grander testimony and a witness for God Himself. And so James implies, or James employs rather, the word happy to denote what kind of individuals these were that endured that kind of suffering. They were happy people. The word here, happy, used here is usually translated blessed inside of our Bibles, our King James Bibles tonight. And this is the word that's used throughout the Beatitudes. Blessed is the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those that mourn. And so you get the idea. They're happy. They're blessed individuals. Now, the idea here of happiness, if you will, or of being blessed, it denotes something different and even deeper than a smile or a laugh. This isn't just a casual, oh, that was funny, or hey, I'm on a roller coaster and I'm having just a great time. Now, this denotes something a lot different and a lot deeper than a smile or a laugh. This refers to a settled peace of mind, knowing that what I am going through presently is going to bring something much better later on. So to put it in real terms, the idea of becoming this blessed person here means that what I'm going through right now, I may not feel so happy in the sense that I have a smile on my face and I'm laughing about it. I may even be mourning at times and questioning at times, but the end result is really what we're looking down the line towards. And in that capacity, James says that such individuals are blessed indeed. The person blessed then, according to this verse number 11, is the believer who endures through suffering. Now pay attention to this. It's not just the suffering believer that is blessed or happy, but it is the believer that endures through such suffering inside their life. To just go into suffering or to suffer some extent of suffering and to quit or to faint or to give up or to fail in the middle of that suffering is not going to cause the blessing of God to come our way inside of our life. Rather, James is drawing our attention to the fact that it is those that have endured through suffering that come out on the other side of it and are blessed indeed. So therefore, patience, suffering patiently, or endurance, if you will, is not a sprint. It's not to be viewed in terms of a 50-yard dash or a 100-yard dash. It's not a sprint. It speaks of how long you can last or how long you can carry on with something prevailing inside of your life. It carries the idea of long suffering long with something, suffering through something, and not letting it get the best of you, not letting it defeat you or knock you out of the race, but you pressing on in spite of the present difficult circumstances. Remember back in chapter 1 of James in verse number 12, the idea is used there of being a blessed individual, or James says in James 1:12, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord hath promised to them that love him. James in verse number 12 there of chapter number 1 uses it in the same context of meaning that this person has endured through temptation, meaning he didn't fail in the temptation. He was tempted, but he remained strong through the temptation. He didn't fail or falter in the middle of the temptation. And James says such a person comes out on the other end of that temptation as a blessed individual. He now uses the blessed man as the one who does not faint in the day of adversity because his strength would be small or little. Now, James gives to us a specific example of someone who endured a great amount of suffering and was blessed because of it. He draws our attention to a man in the Old Testament by the name of Job, and all of us know the story of Job here this evening. And Job endured unimaginable and almost unexplainable amounts of suffering inside of his life. He lost his children. He lost his wealth. He lost his health. He lost his reputation. And he even lost, for a time, the very sense of God's presence inside of his own personal life. Through all of this that Job suffered, he verbalized his misery. We don't see Job as being one of these unrealistic people. You ever met those? They had this superficialness about them that you can tell almost that although they're supposed to be sad, that they're not acting sad, but you can tell it's almost like a put on. Job wasn't one of those kinds of people. He was a realist. Okay, the boils all over his body caused him pain, and he cried in anguish. All right, the losing of his children caused him a lot of pain inside of his life. Having his wife tell him to curse God and die really broke his heart, and so he verbalizes his misery throughout this book of our Bible, the historical account of it. Now, he even complained of his supposed friends' counsel. They were miserable counselors at that. He said, "You guys are the worst friends a guy could ever have," and so he complains about all that. And even throughout this account of Job's suffering, he even expresses his confusion. At the end of the thing, he's just, God, I don't know. I can't wrap my head around it. I don't understand. I don't know what you are doing. And so Job suffered immensely in his life, and he complains, and he verbalizes, and he expresses his confusion over everything that's going on. And at the end of the day, he just says, God, I have no clue. I can't understand. I can't trace or figure out what you're doing in my life. But in all of this, we are told that Job never charged God foolishly. He never charged God foolishly. I think the gist of that is this. He never said, God, okay, if this is how it's going to be, I quit. He never came to the place inside of his life where he said, God, you are unfair to treat me like this, and I'm going to walk away from you. In fact, we find the determination of Job to endure through all of his trials seen in his statement in chapter 13 and verse number 15, one of the premier verses of the book of Job. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. In other words, what Job is saying there, grab a hold of this tonight, that whatever God brings my way. Now, he's not saying this in chapter 1 in verse number 1. He's saying this in Job chapter 13 after he's lost his children, after his wife has kind of turned against him and lost the faith, after he's lost all of his wealth, after he's lost all of his health, after his friends have accused him and his reputation is now smeared, after he's already confessed that he can't quite figure out what God's doing inside of his life, he still carries on with this determination. And he says, you know what? If God delivers me the ultimate blow of death, and if he takes my life, though he slay me, Job says, I'm still going to trust him. You know what that means? I'm still going to say, God, you're right at the end of the day. And he goes on. I love this. A lot of folks miss this. In that verse, he says, yet will I maintain mine own ways before him. What Job is saying is I may feel like I'm dying here from everything God's putting in my life, but I'm still going to worship worship Him. I'm going to do the same thing today that I did yesterday. I'm going to maintain. I'm going to stay the course. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to keep worshiping. In fact, I've been told that when Job went outside and he sat down at that ash heap, that ash heap was probably more than likely the ashes from the animals that Job would have been sacrificing in worship to God. And so if that is the case, Job just says, I'm going to nestle up just as close as I can get to you, God. I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have anyone else to turn to. And I'm determined that I'm going to see this thing through to the end. God, give us some people that's got that kind of determination about them. Through all that he went through, we can see, through all that Job went through, we can see at least 4 divine purposes for Job's suffering that are counted as blessings in hindsight. The first thing that we see as far as a divine purpose in Job's suffering is this, that Job's suffering had the purpose of proving the genuineness of his faith. Job's suffering proved the genuineness of his faith. You say, preacher, how does that really happen? Well, we're told that the trying of our faith doesn't only work patience in our life, as we're going to see, but it actually proves the genuineness or the authenticity of our faith. If we were, and we don't have time this evening, but if we were to go in our Bibles back to Matthew chapter number 7, we would find Jesus at the end of his Sermon on the Mount giving a parable of the 2 foundations. Remember that? And so there was 2 structures that were built. One was built on a rock and one was built on the sand. And it wasn't the veneer. It wasn't the paint job. It wasn't the exterior siding. It wasn't the windows. It wasn't the color schemes that showed the validity or the authenticity of faith inside of that parable, but it was the storms of life. It was the storm that proved the validity, whether the house was actually founded on a rock or if it was founded on some other substance. That was the issue of the real test. Was not what it looks like when the sun's shining. We all look like Christians then. I know lost people. I know lost people that have good morals about them. I know lost people that don't do some of the things that we preach against, and they look good. And I know a lot of professing believers that have looked very good inside their life, and everything seemed like it was going well for them. But it's in the midst of the trials and the storms, the afflictions of our life. And if you walk away from it in those times, if you walk away from faith and you stay away from faith, then I believe what we see is exactly what John tells us, that such individuals go out from us because they were never of us. They never had, and they never were what we really are. And so the sufferings then that Job went through proved the genuineness of his faith. Secondly, another purpose here inside of his sufferings was to disprove Satan's accusation against Job. To disprove Satan's accusation against Job. You remember that very early on in Job chapter number 1, where there was a day, when the sons of men came to, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also in their presence, and God asked that one question. Remember, hast thou considered my servant Job? Have you thought about him? And what God's doing is He's setting him up as a spectacle. He's saying, here's an example of one of mine. Here's somebody that worships me. And so here's the accusation coming from Satan in Job chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. Satan says, doth Job fear God for naught? Verse number 10, hast not thou made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. Now, Satan says and accuses the Lord and Job and says, the only reason why Job serves you is because you've just given him so many blessings, because you've prospered him, and you've pampered him, and that's the only reason why he's really serving you, and the only reason why he's devoted to you. And Satan goes on to say, if you just lift that hedge and give me a little room, he said, I can have him cursing you before sunset this evening. And so God pushes the boundaries back, always in control. God's always sovereignly in control, always sets the perimeters here, always providentially in control. He sets the perimeters of the suffering, of the affliction, and Satan goes to work. And you know how it all goes, and it comes another day, and the perimeters are stretched out a little bit further, and now all the health of Job is really dissipated away. And in all of this suffering, one of the divine purposes was God could look Satan, if he wanted to, eyeball to eyeball, and said, "See, I told you so." That's not the reason why my children don't serve me for a paycheck and a pension. My children don't serve me for health. My children serve me for one primary motivation, because I love them and they love me back. As simple as that. A third purpose, divine purpose through Job's suffering, as we recall him as a premier example of suffering, is this: it was given to strengthen his faith. Suffering was brought into Job's life to strengthen his faith. This is what James had told us earlier on inside of this epistle, chapter 1 and verse number 3, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. It worketh patience. That is the trials and the afflictions and the sufferings that we go through only make us stronger. Remember Paul said to us that we are to exercise ourselves rather unto godliness. That is spiritual exercises, which, by the way, a lot of us are very apathetic when it comes to spiritual disciplines inside of our life. If anything goes in our life, it's the spiritual disciplines. We keep our physical disciplines. Nobody has to force us to eat. Nobody has to force us to sleep. Nobody has to force us to draw a paycheck. Nobody has to force us to do many of the physical disciplines that we have inside our life, to wash and to bathe ourselves and all that kind of stuff. Some maybe possibly could do a little bit better with that. Amen. But I'm not looking at you necessarily, Brother Robbie. And so, we could maybe some of us stand to do a little bit better with that at times. But if anything really goes, I can give you an example. Tomorrow morning, if you wake up and you're rushing, you'll not do probably without breakfast, but you'll skip your Bible reading. You'll say, "I'll just catch up on that later." Why don't you catch up on your calorie count later on? Right? And so one thing that suffering does, because those of you that have suffered in some great capacity know this as believers, that it is through those times of suffering that you, just like Job and just like some of these premier examples from our Bible tell us, that during those times of suffering, you learn to rely upon God, because nobody else understands. And you can talk to preachers, and you can talk to parents, and you can talk to friends, and you can watch Dr. Phil, and you can do all of those things. And at the end of the day, all that you really need is to climb up into your Heavenly Father's lap and cry, "Abba, Father," and tell Him, and He's the only one that can help. And such reliance, such dependence. This is what Jesus was teaching us just in the model of prayer in Matthew chapter 6. To pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." God, do for me. Help me to rely. Help me to depend on you for my every need. And this increases our faith. And then fourthly, a final divine purpose that we see from the sufferings of Job was that suffering was intended to increase Job's possessions. Suffering was intended to increase Job's possessions. This becomes very, very evident by the time you get to the latter part of the book of Job. In the closing portions of Scripture there, it becomes very obvious that from the outset, hidden from Job, not as a motivation for Job, but in the secret counsel of a thrice holy God, God had in mind giving him more than he ever had to start with. All of this is what James refers to inside of our verse tonight, verse number 11, as the end of the Lord. Let's read it again together tonight. "Behold," James says, "we count them happy which endure." Here's the example. "Ye have heard of the patience," that is the endurance of Job, "and have seen the end." There's the expression, "the end of the Lord." What does that mean? Well, it means that this was the goal of God from the very outset. When you get to the end of the book of Job, this reveals to us what the desire and the intentions of God was from the very outset of the situation. God wasn't intending on destroying. He wasn't trying to upset. He wasn't trying to hurt. He had in his mind, when Job endured through all of those things, God had in mind from the very outset that He was going to bless him in this capacity. It's interesting to me really to see the difference in perspective. The difference in perspective. If you were to look from the vantage point of Satan and his desires inside of the sufferings of Job, his desire was not to prosper Job, it wasn't to bless Job, it was to destroy the faith of Job and to really ruin the reputation of God. He hates God and therefore hates anyone that associates or aligns themselves with God. So Satan's desire was to destroy the faith of Job and ruin the reputation of God. I remind you of what Jesus said about Satan tonight, that he is a liar, that he is a murderer from the very beginning, and that he comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. Understand one of the underlying motives and intentions through the suffering that you're going through is to have you completely destroyed. Right? But such desire doesn't come from the throne room of heaven. It comes from a lesser power, a lesser entity, if you will. Remember, this is what Jesus said to Peter. Jesus said to Peter, you're fixing to go through some trials, a severe test of trial inside of your life. And he says this to Peter. He says, and Satan has desired to have you, that he may sift you as the wheat. And so Jesus says, not to Peter, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But he says to Peter, don't you worry. I have prayed for you. So therefore we see the resilience and the endurance of Job and those like him doesn't come from ourselves, but it comes from the God who equips us to go through those times of suffering. The desire of Satan was to destroy and to ruin, but God's plan was to establish Job's faith deeper and to give more credence to himself. If you had asked Job in Job chapter number 1, would God ever do this to you? And if God ever did this to you, would you remain resilient through it? Job may have answered in the affirmative with that, but he may have lacked some confidence behind him. But on the latter portion of his life, he could say, even again in the middle of all of those instances, he could say, because of the increase of strength and faith inside of his life, he could say, God can bring my way whatever he chooses to, because I know he does all things well in my life. Remember that God always then has our good in mind. I think this is the lesson for us to really grasp hold of tonight through what James is giving to us, that God always has our good in mind, even though some things don't feel very pleasant to us inside of our lives. But our feelings are not to be held, our feelings are to be held in comparison with our eternities. Our feelings are to be held in comparison with our eternities. What you feel presently may not feel so good, but through the eye of faith, looking down through the scope of time, that's what we are looking to. Remember what Solomon said, let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Let's think about how something is going to end. Romans chapter 8 and verse number 18, Paul writes, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Paul said you could compare it, but it's really not even a good comparison. It's not a fair comparison. Paul says the sufferings of this present time are not even worthy to be compared with the glory that's going to be revealed in us, futuristic inside of our life. James closes here in verse number 11 by reminding us that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. The Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. If you have ever suffered through a great trial and asked yourself a question like this, does God really care for me? If you've ever asked yourself that kind of question, here is your opportunity from the Scriptures to have that question answered. And James says that the Lord is very pitiful and He is of tender mercy. This expression, very pitiful here, the word used literally means many bowed. Many bowed. This reflects the Hebrew idiom which uses the bowels as the seat of emotion instead of the heart. Which means, from Hellenization and Greek influence, we would say, I would say to my wife, I love you with all of my heart. The Hebrews didn't use the heart as the seat of the emotions. They used their bowels. And you could get really funny with that, of course. And you could, maybe say to your significant other, baby, you really move me, or something like that. A lot of things you could say there, of course. And we'll try to delete that from the message. This is literally the translation that James was saying when he says the Lord is very pitiful. He's saying God is full. God, to put it in our vernacular, God's heart is full of love and concern for us. If you ever question, does God really care about me? Does God really love me? Let me answer that from the Scriptures. Absolutely. In fact, He doesn't just love you a little bit, and He doesn't just love you, kind of mediocre, but God's heart, there's no more capacity. God's heart is full of love for us. He also says that God is of tender mercy. This speaks along the same lines, but it also shows something a little different, and I enjoyed this as I was studying. It shows that God will be sure to withhold any suffering from us that would not benefit us. Remember, the ideas of grace and mercy are almost used interchangeably, especially in the Old Testament. You see the word mercy show up, but it was actually a Hebrew word for grace, and the Septuagint would translate it as charis, and the Greek form of grace. So the two terms are used interchangeably, but there is a distinction really made in our language where grace is God giving something that you do not deserve, and where mercy is really the withholding of what we do deserve. So both combine together inside of the doctrine of salvation. And so when James says that God is of a tender mercy, he's saying that God is very careful here in the regards to your suffering, not to allow any kind of suffering to come into your life that would not be of a benefit to you. In other words, God then would be likened to a master chef, and He only adds in the ingredients to your life that are contributing to the overall good of our lives and for His ultimate glory. He only allows what is right for us inside of our life, and as such then He carefully sifts through all of our troubles, only allowing what would be good for us to actually pass into real terms into our lives. Now remember tonight as we close then that a child may think some same thoughts similar to what we're compelled to think during times of suffering. A child may be forced to think as a parent begins to enforce discipline. A child may begin to think, even more particularly the younger children who haven't come to really grasp hold of love and compassion and kindness. And a child may be forced to think, why is my parent scolding me or spanking me, or why are they taking away this toy, and why did they not let me have the whole bag of candy corn, And I just say that because I already ate one. And so why? And so a child could begin to question along these same lines. The child at younger stages may confuse love with anger. But with age and maturity, we come to realize that our parents always have had our good in mind, even through times of discipline. They disciplined us because they love us. And so too, we can, as the children of God, see that God does all things well inside of our life, and that He's never moved to destroy us or never doing something because He is mad or hates us. But even everything He's doing, just like we're seeing on Sunday nights with the southern kingdom of Judah, He does those things because He loves us. And so Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 4 and verse number 16, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us," that is, it's good for our good, "worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen," that is our present afflictions, "but we rather look at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen," what you can't see tonight, is what really matters because it's of eternal value. Let's stand tonight for prayer.